Chapter 4, Part 1 of the Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Publius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 4, Part 1. Nearly about midday, when the power of the sun causes everything to be hot, we turned into a certain village, to some old men who were known by, and familiar with, the robbers. For their first salutation, their long conference, and their mutual kisses, enabled me to perceive this, though I was an ass. For they presented them with gifts from the things which were on my back, and by whispers seemed to indicate that these gifts were obtained by plunder. And now, having lightened us of all our burden, they sent us into the nearest meadow, that we might there freely feed. Society and feeding, however, could not detain me with the ass, or with my horse, because I was as yet unaccustomed to eat hay. But as I was now perishing with hunger, I boldly entered into a little garden which I saw behind the stable, and filled my belly abundantly with pot herbs, though they were raw. Invoking likewise all the gods, I inspected every place, in order to see if by chance I could find in the neighbouring gardens some rose trees resplendent with a fiery redness. For the solitude of my situation now afforded me good hope, that if, being removed from the public road, and concealed by groves of trees, I should, by taking the remedy, be raised on my feet, I should then, unseen by any one, be again transformed into the human shape, from the prone step of a four-footed beast. Whilst, therefore, I was fluctuating in that sea of thought, I beheld, a little further, a valley shaded by a leafy grove, among the various plants and most pleasant verdure of which, the bright colour of red roses shone forth to the view. And now in my breast, which was not entirely brutal, I thought that the grove was sacred to Venus and the Graces, in whose shady recesses the royal splendour of that genial flower, the rose, was relucent. Then, having invoked joyful and prosperous event, I ran rapidly, so that by Hercules I myself thought that I was not an ass, but that, through excessive velocity, I was changed into a swift horse. That agility, however, and excellent endeavour of mine could not prevent the malignity of my fate. For when I was now nearer to this place, I no longer saw those fresh and delectable roses, wet with divine dew and nectar, which felicitous brambles and blessed thorns produce. Nor did I behold any valley, but only the margin of a river's bank, environed with thick-set trees. These trees had oblong leaves like the laurel, and produced extended and reddish cups, after the manner of a flower that has no scent, which, nevertheless, are fragrant, are called by the unlearned vulgar by a name not at all rustic, laurel roses, and when eaten are deadly to all cattle. Being entangled with such adverse fates, and rejecting even safety itself, I spontaneously longed to eat of those envenomed roses. But while I slowly approached in order to pluck them, a certain young man, who, as it appeared to me, was a gardener, perceiving the great loss he had sustained by my having destroyed all his herbs, furiously ran to me with a great staff in his hand, and taking hold of me, inflicted on me so many blows, that I should have been in danger of losing my life, unless I had at length prudently given assistance to myself. For with my posterior parts elevated, I frequently kicked him with my hind feet, and having severely punished him, and laid him prostrate at the foot of the next mountain, I liberated myself by flight. Immediately, however, a certain woman, viz. The wife of the gardener, as soon as she beheld him from an eminence, prostrate and half dead, flew to him with lamentation and howling, in order that by her own commiseration she might be the occasion of my present destruction. For all the rustics, being excited by her lamentations, immediately called out their dogs, and everywhere incited them, that being driven by fury, they might rush upon and tear me in pieces. I therefore, being without doubt at that time near to death, when I saw that the dogs, who were congregated and exasperated against me, were large and numerous, and fit to fight with bears and lions, availing myself of the counsel suggested by the existing circumstance, put an end to my flight, and again, with rapid steps, returned to the stable from which I came. But the rustics having seized me, the dogs being with difficulty restrained, and bound me with a very strong thong of leather to the staple of a post, would, without doubt, have scourged me to death, if my belly, compressed by the pain of the blows, filled with those raw herbs, and disordered with a slippery flux, had not by ejecting dung as though through a tube, driven away some besprinkling them, and others by the fetid odour which was emitted from my now broken shoulders. And without delay, it being now nearly noon, the robbers again led us from the stable heavily laden, and especially me, whose burden was far greater than that of the rest. Now also, when a good part of the journey was finished, I being exhausted with the length of the way, oppressed with the weight of the burden, and fatigued with the blows of the staves, and likewise now being lame and staggering from the worn-out condition of my hoofs, as I was walking near a certain rivulet of gently flowing and winding water, I thought, having happily found an excellent opportunity, I would cunningly lie down with my legs bent under me, fully determined not to rise from thence, whatever blows might be inflicted on me, and being also prepared, not only to be beaten, but to die pierced with a sword. For I thought that being now perfectly exhausted and debil, I should be dismissed on account of bodily infirmity, or that the robbers would certainly divide the burden which I carried on my back between the two other beasts, partly through impatience of delay, and partly through a desire of accomplishing their destined flight, and that, instead of a deeper revenge, they would leave me a prey to wolves and vultures. My evil destiny, however, prevented the execution of so excellent a design. For the other ass, having divined and preconceived my intention, suddenly feigning lassitude, fell down with all that he carried, and lying as if he was dead, did not endeavour to rise, either by the blows of the staves, or by being pricked and raised in all parts by the tail, the ears, and the legs, till the robbers, being wearied with posthumous hope, and having conferred with each other, in order that their flight might not be retarded by attending so long on a dead, or rather stony ass, they divided his burthen between me and the horse, cut off his legs with a drawn sword, and drawing him, still breathing, a little out of the public road, threw him down a lofty precipice into a neighbouring valley. Then I, considering with myself the destiny of my unhappy companion, determined, laying aside guile and fraud, to prove myself to my masters to be a worthy ass. For I heard them saying to each other that we should soon stop, and that then the whole of our journey would be finished, in consequence of having arrived at the place of their abode. At length, having passed over a little hill of easy ascent, we arrived at the destined place, where all the bundles being untied, and brought into their habitation, as I was now liberated from my burden, I refreshed myself by rolling in the dust, instead of making use of a bath. Both the thing, however, and the occasion itself demand that I should here give a description of the places and the cavern in which the robbers dwelt. For thus I shall at the same time make trial of my own genius, and enable the reader to perceive clearly whether I was also an ass in understanding and sense. There was a dreadful mountain shaded by the trees of a forest, and lofty in the extreme. The oblique windings of this, in the part of which it was surrounded with the most rugged and therefore inaccessible rocks, were environed with valleys full of very deep receptacles of water, and everywhere thick set with thorns, which afforded a native defence. The streams of a fountain falling from the summit of the mountain spread themselves in large bubbles, and rolling through the declivities, poured forth water as bright as silver, and being now divided into many rivulets, and irrigating those valleys with stagnant floods, they enclosed the whole like a calm sea, or a sluggish river. Where the borders of the mountain end, a lofty tower rose over the cavern, fortified by a sheepcot consisting of strong hurdles, well adapted for the habitation of sheep, and having its sides every way extended. Before the door, small branches expanded themselves, so as to serve instead of a wall, and which you might certainly, on my authority, denominate the courtyard of robbers. Nor was it scarcely anything else than a small cottage, covered in a disorderly manner with reeds, in which spies, selected by lot from the band of robbers, as I afterwards found, watched by night. Into this place, where they had with difficulty penetrated, one after another, with their members compressed, on account of the narrowness of the entrance, I and my companion being secured by a strong bridle before the door, they thus spoke in anger to a certain old woman, who was bent with the weight of old age, and to whom alone the safety and protection of so many young men appeared to be committed. Do you, who are the last relics of the grave, the chief disgrace of life, and the only thing loathed by hell, thus idly sitting at home, sport with us, nor afford any solace to these our labours so great and so dangerous, by at least providing for us a supper, though late? You, who are accustomed to do nothing else by day and by night than greedily ingurgitate wine in your insatiable stomach. The old woman, trembling and fearful, on hearing them thus speak, replied, But, O young men, my most puissant and faithful preservers, there is an abundance of pottage for you well boiled, with a pleasant flavour. There is also a great quantity of bread, wine plentiful poured into well purified bowls, and warm water prepared according to custom for your hasty bath. When she had thus spoken, they immediately undressed themselves, and being naked, refreshed by the heat of a great fire, sprinkled with water, and anointed with oil, they reclined before tables largely furnished with food. They were, however, scarcely seated, when behold a far greater number of other young men entered, whom you would immediately suppose to be similarly thieves, for they also brought with them plunder, viz. Gold and silver coin, vases, and silken garments interwoven with golden threads. These being refreshed by similar bathing, seated themselves on the beds of their companions, and some of them, being selected by lot, were ministrant to the rest. They eat and drink in a disorderly manner, and pottage and bread and bowls of wine were heaped in abundance on the tables. They play clamorously, they sing strenuously, and they jest contumeliously, and in everything else resemble the Theban Lapithae and the semi-brutal Centaurs. Then one among them, who surpassed the rest in strength, said, We indeed bravely broke open the house of Milo of Hypata, and besides so great an abundance of wealth, which we strenuously procured for ourselves, through our fortitude, we departed to our camps with all our band in safety, and have returned home with an increase of 8 feet. If this is to be at all considered as contributing to our gain, but you, who have robbed in the Boeotian cities, have brought back a debile number of your troop, having lost your most brave leader Lamachus, whose life I should deservedly prefer to all the spoil which you have brought home. His too great fortitude, however, was his destruction. But the memory of so great a man will be celebrated among that of illustrious kings, and the leaders of armies. As to you, who are frugal robbers, you exercise the scrutinizing art in small and servile thefts, timidly creeping through baths, and the little houses of old women. To this one of the latter band replied, Are you alone ignorant that larger houses are much more easily plundered? For though large houses contain a great number of servants, yet each of these is more attentive to his own safety than to the wealth of his master. But men who lead a frugal and private life more sharply defend and guard their fortune, if small, at the hazard of their life, or if ample, preserve it cautiously concealed. And in the last place, the thing itself will verify what I have asserted. For we had scarcely arrived at Thebes, the city of 7 gates, when while we diligently inquire after the wealth of each of the citizens, which is the primary study of this our art, a certain usurer named Chryseros, who was master of a great sum of money, was not concealed from us, who through the fear of offices and public employments pretended with great art not to be opulent. Lastly, this man living alone, and remote from others, contented with a small well-fortified cottage, but beggarly in his apparel and sordid in his expenditure, sat brooding over his bags of gold. We agreed, therefore, first to break into his house, in order that, despising the resistance of only one hand, i.e. the hand of Chryseros, we might, without any difficulty, quietly obtain all his wealth. Without delay, therefore, as soon as it was night, we waited before his gate, as it did not appear to us to be prudent either to take it off the hinges, or remove it, or break it open, lest the noise of the folding doors should raise all the neighbourhood to our destruction. Then that magnanimous standard-bearer, our Lamachus, through confidence in his well-tried valour, gradually introducing his hand into that part of the gate which was perforated for the purpose of putting in the key, endeavoured to draw back the bolt. But Chryseros, the most iniquitous of all bipeds, having been for some time awake, and perceiving what was transacted, gradually crept to the door with a gentle step, and at the same time preserving a profound silence, and suddenly, with a most powerful effort, fastened the hand of our leader, with a great nail, to a plank of the door. Leaving him also thus fixed by a deadly bond, he ascended to the roof of the cottage, and from thence vociferating with a very loud voice, beseeching his neighbours, and calling them by their respective names, and admonishing them to regard their common safety, he exclaimed that his house was unexpectedly on fire. Thus every one, being terrified by the proximity of the impending danger, anxiously ran to procure assistance. Then we, being placed in the ambiguous peril either of falling into the hands of those who were alarmed by the cries of Chryseros, or of deserting our companion, devised, by his consent, the occasion requiring it, a strenuous remedy. For we cut off that part of the arm of our leader which joins the hand to the shoulder, by a blow inflicted through the middle articulation. And having left the arm there, we bound up his wound with many rags, lest the drops of blood should betray our steps, and hastily took with us what remained of Lamachus. And while, ignorant of the men in the place, we are urged by the great tumult, and terrified into flight by the instant danger, he, not being able either to follow us rapidly, or to remain where he was securely, the magnanimous and transcendently brave man, entreating us with many words and many prayers, exhorted us by the right hand of Mars, and by the faith of our oath, to liberate him, who was a good fellow soldier, both from torment and captivity. For how is it possible that a bold robber can survive his right hand, by which alone he is able to plunder and kill? He added, that he should be sufficiently happy to be willingly slain by the hand of one of his associates. And when he could not persuade any one of us to commit a voluntary parricide, he drew his sword with the hand that remained, and having for a long time kissed it, plunged it with a most powerful stroke through the middle of his breast. Then we, venerating the vigour of our magnanimous leader, diligently wrapped his mutilated dead body in a linen garment, and committed it to the sea to be concealed. And now our Lamachus lies buried in all that element. And he, indeed, terminated his life in a manner worthy of his virtues. Moreover, Alcimus could not withdraw himself from the sinister knot of fortune by his sagacious undertakings. For he, having broken open the cottage of an old woman, while she was asleep, when he had ascended into an upper bedchamber, and ought immediately to have slain her, by strangling her, was willing first to throw to us everything out of a loftier window, in order that we might take it away. And when he had now strenuously thrown out all her goods, and was not willing to spare even the bed of the sleeping old woman, having rolled her out of it, he prepared, in like manner, to throw out the counterpane which covered her. But the most iniquitous woman, falling at his knees, deprecated him as follows: Why, O my son, I beseech you, do you give the poor and lacerated furniture of a miserable old woman to my opulent neighbours, to whose houses this window extends? Alcimus, being deceived by the crafty cunning of these words, and believing that what she said was true, fearing lest what he had thrown out before, and what he might throw out afterwards, should, through his mistake, not fall into the hands of his associates, but into other houses, thrust his body out of the window, in order that he might sagaciously survey every thing, and particularly the contiguous houses, of which the old woman had spoken. While, however, he was attempting this, strenuously indeed, but without sufficient caution, that most wicked old woman, while yet he was inclining downwards and pendulous, and perfectly astounded with the survey, threw him out headlong, with an impulse which, though feeble, was nevertheless sudden and unexpected. But he, falling not only from a great height, but also on a prodigiously great stone, which happened to lie near the house, separated and burst the articulation of his ribs, and vomiting rivers of blood, escaped from life without being long tormented, having first narrated to us what had been transacted. Him we also buried in a manner similar to the funeral of our former leader, and gave him as a good companion to Lamachus. Then, suffering the wound of a double loss, and rejecting our Theban enterprise, we went to the next city, which is Plataea. There we found a certain man of great fame, whose name was Demochares, about to exhibit the spectacle of gladiators. For this man, being of most noble birth, and excelling in wealth and liberality, procured pleasures for the public with a splendour worthy of his fortune. Where is the man whose genius is so great, or whose eloquence is so powerful, as to be able to explain, in appropriate words, the several species of the manifold apparatus? Here were gladiators famous for the dexterity of their hand, there hunters of well-tried celerity, and in another place criminals preparing for their banquets with insane tranquillity, food to fatten wild beasts. There were stages consisting of beams fixed in each other, towers formed from the junction of planks, after the manner of a circumforaneous house, in which were elegant pictures, and which were the beautiful receptacles of the hunting which was to be exhibited in the circus. And besides this, who can enumerate the multitude and the different kinds of wild beasts? For with the greatest diligence he had been careful to procure from abroad those noble sepulchres of condemned heads. But besides the other apparatus of so beautiful a spectacle, he had procured in some way or other, with all the wealth of his patrimony, a great number of very large bears. For besides those which he had captured by hunting, and besides those which he had bought for a great price, he also solicitously nourished others with sumptuous care, which his friends, contending with each other in kindness, had sent him as gifts. This apparatus, however, of the public pleasure, so illustrious and so splendid, could not escape the noxious eyes of envy. For these bears, being unwearied with their long captivity, and at the same time macerated with the burning heat of summer, and being also morbid from long indolence, were seized with a sudden pestilence, and reduced to a very inconsiderable number. Hence you might everywhere see lying in the streets ferine shipwrecks of half animated bodies. Then the ignoble vulgar, whom rude poverty compelled to seek for sordid succour to their emaciated belly and gratuitous food, began to run to the meat which was scattered everywhere. Finding this to be the case, I and this Babulus thought of the following subtle stratagem. We brought to our lodging a bear which surpassed the rest in fatness of body, as if we intended to prepare it for food, and having perfectly stripped the skin from the flesh, and carefully preserved all his nails, the head of the beast being also left entire, as far as to the confine of the neck, we attenuate the whole hide by diligently scraping it, and sprinkling it with ashes reduced to a fine powder, expose it to the sun to be dried. And while it is purified by the heat of that celestial fire, we, in the meantime, being powerfully fattened with the muscular flesh of the bear, made those of the troop that were present take the following oath, viz., that one of our number who excelled the rest, not so much in strength of body as in fortitude, and who especially should undertake this voluntarily, should assume the form of a bear, being covered with that skin, and that also, being brought into the house of Demochares, he should afford to us an easy entrance through the gate, in the opportune silence of the night. This crafty transformation encouraged many of our most valiant associates to engage in the undertaking, and Thrasyleon, being elected by the suffrages of the band in preference to the rest, adventured the peril of that doubtful machine, the hide of the bear. And now, with a serene countenance, he concealed himself in the hide, which was now pliable and tractable through its softness. Then we sewed up the extreme parts with a fine seam, and covering the opening of it, though very narrow, with a multitude of surrounding hairs. We also put the head of Thrasyleon into the skin, near the throat, in which the neck of the beast had been cut off. And having left small holes about the nostrils and eyes, for the purpose of respiration, we enclosed our most brave associate, who was now entirely made a brute, in a cage which we had bought for a small sum of money, into which he hastily crept with constant vigour of mind. Thus, the first principles of the fallacy being begun, we proceeded as follows to the rest. Having obtained by inquiry the name of one Nicanor, who derived his origin from a Thracian race, and between whom and Demochares there was the greatest friendship, we counterfeited a letter, in which that excellent friend was made to say that he had dedicated the first fruits of his hunting to Demochares as an ornamental gift. And now, the evening being far advanced, trusting to the assistance of darkness, we presented to Demochares the cage in which Thrasyleon was enclosed, together with that forged epistle. But he, admiring the magnitude of the beast, and being delighted with the opportune liberality of his friend, ordered that 10 pieces of golden coin should be immediately told out, from the little coffers which he had with him, to us who had brought him so acceptable a present. Then, as novelty is accustomed to excite the minds of men to sudden spectacles, many ran together to the brute, admiring its size, whose more curious inspection our Thrasyleon restrained in a sufficiently crafty manner, by advancing towards them in a threatening attitude. And the citizens, with one according voice, proclaimed Demochares completely happy and blessed, who, after so great a destruction of wild beasts, had been able to resist, in some way or other, the attacks of ill fortune by a new supply. He ordered, therefore, that the beast should be immediately taken to his newly fallowed land, and that he should be brought back from thence, when it was requisite, with the greatest care. To this, however, I subjoined, Be careful, sir, that you do not suffer this animal, who is fatigued with the heat of the sun, and the length of the way, to be mingled with a crowd of many wild beasts, and which I hear are not well, but rather provide some place of your house for him, which is open and exposed to the wind, or rather which borders on some lake, and is cool. Do you not know that animals of this kind always couch in shady groves and humid caves, and on pleasant hills and near gathered fountains? Demochares, being alarmed by these admonitions, and considering with himself how many wild beasts he had already lost, assented, without hesitation, to what I said, and readily permitted us to put the cage wherever we pleased. But I said, we also are ready to watch by night, in this very place before the cage, in order that we may more accurately administer meat to the beast seasonably, and give him his accustomed drink, as he is fatigued from the inconvenience of the heat, and the trouble he has suffered in being brought hither. To this Demochares answered, we are not in want of your labour, for now nearly all my servants are, from long custom, skilled in feeding bears. After this, having bade him farewell, we departed, and going out of the gate of the city, we beheld a certain monument, raised at a considerable distance from the public road, in a solitary and secret place. There we opened certain coffins, which, through rottenness and age, were only half covered, and which contained dead bodies, that were now nothing but dust and ashes, as the receptacles of our future spoil. And having, according to the rules of our art, observed the time of the night in which the moon does not shine, and in which sleep powerfully invades and oppresses the hearts of mortals with its first impetus, we stopped, with our band armed with swords, before the doors themselves of Demochares, as if we had come, according to agreement, to plunder his house. Nor did Thrasyleon less accurately creep out of his cage, availing himself of that time of the night which is adapted to theft, and immediately slew, with a sword, all the guards that were sleeping near him, and directly after the porter himself. Taking the key also, he opened the folding doors of the gate, and to us, who promptly ran and were received into the interior parts of the house, he pointed out a treasury, where, in the evening, he had cunningly seen many silver vessels deposited. This being immediately broken open, through the force of our compact cohort, I ordered each of my associates to take as much gold and silver as he could, quickly conceal it in those habitations of the most faithful dead, and returning with speedy steps, reiterate his burdens. For I said that I alone would remain before the doors of the house, attentively observing everything that occurred, till they returned, as this would contribute to our common good. For it appeared to me that the form of a bear, running through the middle of the house, was adapted to terrify any of the servants who might happen to be awake. For who, however brave and intrepid he might be, would not, on beholding the stupendous form of so great a beast, especially in the night, immediately betake himself to flight, and keep himself, terrified and trembling, in his bolted chamber? End of chapter 4, part 1.
Chapter 4, Part 2 of The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee J. Seipel. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 4, Part 2. Sinister events, however, opposed all these plans, which were prepared with salutary counsel. For while we were anxiously awaiting for the return of our companions, a certain menial boy, being disturbed, so the gods ordained, by the noise, crept gently forward, and seeing the bear running without restraint through the whole house, he observed the greatest possible silence, returned from whence he came, and told everyone, as far as he was able, what he had seen in the house. And without delay, the whole house was filled with a numerous assemblage of servants. The darkness of the night was illuminated with torches, lamps, wax and tallow candles, and other instruments of nocturnal light. Nor did anyone among so great a multitude come without arms, but all of them being furnished with clubs, spears, and drawn swords, occupy and defend the entrance of the house. They also excited those hunting dogs that have long ears and rough hairs, to repress the beast. Then I, the crowd of servants still increasing, left the house with a retrograde flight. But, concealing myself behind the gate, I beheld Thrasyleon wonderfully resisting the dogs. For though he was arrived at the last goal of life, yet, not being forgetful either of himself or of us, or his pristine fortitude, he struggled against the gaping jaws themselves of Cerberus. Lastly, reclaiming with spirit the scenic person which he had voluntarily assumed, at one time flying and at another resisting, with the various figures and gestures of his body, he at length escaped from the house. Yet, though he had gained his liberty abroad, he was not able to procure his safety by flight. For all the dogs of the next street, who were sufficiently fierce and sufficiently numerous, mingled themselves in the troop of those hunting dogs, which, at the same time, came out of the house, and pursued him in a similar manner. I then beheld a miserable and deadly spectacle, our Thrasyllon surrounded and besieged by troops of dogs, cruelly attacking and lacerating him with numerous bites. Lastly, not enduring to see him suffer such great pain, I mingled myself with the surrounding crowd of people, and thus dissuaded the instigators of the dogs, this being the only thing in which I could give secret assistance to my excellent associate. "O great and extreme wickedness," I said, "we are destroying a large and very precious beast." My artful address, however, to the crowd was of no advantage to the most unhappy youth, for a certain tall and robust man, running out of the house, instantly thrust a spear through the middle of the viscera of the bear, and the like was also done by another person. And behold, many having shaken off fear, contended with each other, and drawing near to, and piercing him with their swords. But Thrasyllon, the illustrious ornament of our band, having at length that spirit of his which was worthy of immortality vanquished, but not his patience, did not violate the faith of his oath by any vociferation or howling, but being now lacerated by the bites of the dogs, cut in pieces by the sword, and imitating with all his might the bellowing of a wild beast, enduring also with a generous vigor his present calamity, reserved for himself glory, and rendered back his life to fate. Nevertheless, he had struck that crowd with such great terror and fear that till dawn, and even when it was broad daylight, no one dared to touch the beast, even with his finger, though he was prostrate on the ground. At length, however, a certain butcher, who was a little bolder than the rest, having slowly and timidly cut open the belly of the beast, stripped the magnificent robber of the bear's hide by which he had been concealed. Thus Thrasyllon also perished for us, but has not perished so far as pertains to renown. We therefore, having immediately collected those bundles which the faithful dead had preserved for us, and quitting, with rapid step, the boundaries of Plataea, frequently considered with ourselves that no fidelity was to be found in life, because faith, hating our perfidy, had descended to the region of departed spirits and the dead. Thus all of us, being fatigued with the weight of our bundles, and the roughness of the way through which we traveled, and also having lost 3 of our associates, we have brought these spoils which you see. After he had thus ended his speech, they poured out wine from golden bowls to the memory of their dead associates. And afterwards, having soothed the god Mars by certain hymns, they slept for a short time. But that old woman distributed to us fresh barley in abundance, and without measure, so that my horse, indeed, having obtained such a great plenty, and enjoying it alone, might think that he was received at a pontifical banquet. I, however, though at other times, while I was a man, I had also eaten barley, gradually broken, diminished by the long-continued section, and boiled in broth, having explored a corner in which the remainder of the bread, belonging to the whole band, had been heaped together, strenuously exercised my jaws, which had been injured by long fasting, and now began to be covered with the webs of spiders. And behold, when the night was far advanced, the robbers, being roused from their sleep, removed their camp, and being variously equipped, so that one part of them was armed with swords, but another was transformed into nightly ghosts, they left their abode in hasty steps. Nevertheless, not even impending sleep could prevent me from eating incessantly and greedily. And though before, when I was Lucius, I could depart from the table, contented with 1 or 2 loaves, yet then indulging my belly, which was so capacious, I had now nearly eaten the 3rd canister of bread. The bright light of day found me intent on this employment, At length, however, being impelled by asinine shame, but reluctantly departing from thence, I assuaged my thirst in a neighboring rivulet. Not long after this, the robbers returned, very anxious and solicitous, bringing with them no bundle whatever, nor even a mean garment, but armed alone with swords. They brought with all their hands and all their forces of the band a virgin of a beautiful form, and, as the magnificence of her habit indicated, one of the first rank of that country. The virgin was, by Hercules, an object of desire even to such an ass as I was. But she was brought in by them, lamenting and tearing her hair, together with her garment. As soon as they had entered into the cavern, they thus addressed her in words intended to mitigate her grief. As you are in perfect security, both with respect to your life and your modesty, give a truce to your sorrow for a few days, for the sake of our gain, the necessity of our poverty compelling us to adopt this mode of life. But your parents, though they are very avaricious, will nevertheless, without delay, give, out of the great wealth which they have accumulated, a sum of money adequate to the redemption of their daughter. By these and similar babblings, the grief of the virgin was by no means appeased, for she wept immoderately, with her head placed between her knees. They, however, called to the old woman within the cavern, and ordered her to sit with the virgin, and console her as much as possible with bland conversation, and then they betook themselves to their accustomed employment. But the virgin could not be recalled from her tears, which she had begun to shed, by any words which the old woman employed, but, deploring more profoundly her condition and agitation which she suffered from her continual sobbing, made me also weep, and she thus lamented: "Is it possible that I, miserable creature, can either cease to weep or consent to live when deprived of such a house, of so many attendants, of such dear little slaves, and of such venerable parents? Since I am now become the prey of unhappy rapine, and made a slave, servilely enclosed in this stony prison, and prevented from the enjoyment of all those delicacies in which I was born and nurtured, I am placed in doubt of my life, and in fear of the torments of executioners, being thus in the power of so many and such outrageous robbers, and of a horrid band of gladiators." The virgin, having thus lamented, and being debilitated with mental grief, the tension of her throat, the fatigue of her body, she dismissed her marked eyes to sleep. She had scarcely, however, closed her eyes, when, shaking off sleep, after the manner of those who are furiously agitated by the nymphs, she began to afflict herself much more grievously, and also to beat her breast with her cruel hands, and to strike her beautiful face. Profoundly sighing also, she thus replied to the old woman, who earnestly inquired what were the causes of her new and restored sorrow: "Now, alas, I am utterly undone. Now I have renounced salutiferous hope. A halter or a sword, or certainly a precipice, must doubtly be embraced by me." On hearing this, the old woman became somewhat more incensed, ordered her with severe countenance to tell her the cause of her sorrow, or why, having been asleep, she thus suddenly renewed her immoderate lamentations. "Do you design," she said, "to defraud my young men of the great sum of money which they will obtain for your redemption? But if you persist any further in indulging this immoderate grief, despising those tears of which robbers make no account, I will cause you to be burnt alive." The virgin, being terrified by these words, kissed the hand of the old woman, and said: "Spare me, my parent, and being mindful of human piety, afford some little aid to my most afflictive condition. For I do not think that commiseration is entirely extinguished in you, who are venerably hoary through more extended age. In the last place, therefore, survey the scene of my calamity. A beautiful youth, of first rank among his fellow citizens, whom the whole city publicly elected for its son, and who, besides this, was my cousin, surpassing me by 3 years only in age, who was nourished and educated with me from infancy, inseparably dwelt with me in the same house, and partook of the same bedchamber and bed, was affianced to me by mutual affection of holy love, and who some time since had been destined by nuptial vows to the marriage compact, and was registered as wedded by the consent of our parents. This youth had immolated victims in the temples and sacred edifices, accompanied by a great multitude of relatives and neighbors. The whole house was covered with laurel, was luminous with torches, and resounded with the nuptial song. Then my unhappy mother, supporting me in her bosom, gracefully decorated me with nuptial ornaments, and frequently giving me sweet kisses, extended with anxious wishes her future hope of offspring. When on a sudden, robbers armed like gladiators, rushing in with great violence, raging as in war, and shining with drawn and threatening sword, did not bring with them the hand of slaughter or rapine, but immediately invaded our bedchamber in a condensed and conglobed band, and without any reluctance, or even the smallest resistance on the part of our servants, they tore me away, miserable creature, lifeless with dire dread, from the bosom of my trembling mother. Thus our nuptials were disturbed and dissolved, like those of Pirithous, the daughter of Anthrax. But behold, now also my misfortune is renewed, or rather is increased, by a most inauspicious dream. For I seem to myself to be violently expelled from my home, from my bedchamber, and lastly from the bed itself, and hurried through inaccessible deserts, to call on the name of my most unfortunate husband. He, however, as soon as he was deprived of my embraces, even then being perfumed with ointments, and adorned with wreaths of flowers, followed my footsteps, while I fled with foreign feet. And while he loudly implored the assistance of the people, lamenting the rape of his beautiful wife, one of the robbers, being moved in indignation through his importunate pursuit, slew the unhappy youth, my husband, by striking him with a great stone which he found lying before his feet. But I, being terrified by the atrocity of the spectacle, am tremblingly roused from the deadly dream. Then the old woman, receiving her lamentations with a sigh, thus began: "Be of good courage, my mistress, and do not terrify yourself with the vain fictions of dreams. For not to mention that the images of diurnal sleep are said to be false, nocturnal visions sometimes signify events contrary to what they represent. Lastly, to weep, to be beat, and sometimes also to be slain in dreams, announces a lucrative or prosperous event, while on the contrary, to laugh, to fill one's belly with delicious food, or to be dissolved in venereal pleasure, predicts affliction from sorrow, bodily disease, or other evils. I, however, will recall you from your grief by pleasant narrations and old woman's fables. In a certain city lived a king and queen who had 3 daughters of conspicuous beauty. Of these, the 2 elder, though of the most agreeable form, were not thought too lovely to be celebrated by the praises of mankind. But the beauty of the younger sister was so great and illustrious that it could neither be expressed nor sufficiently praised by the poverty of human speech. At length, a multitude of citizens and abundance of strangers, whom the rumor of the exalted spectacle had collected together, full of ardent zeal, stupid with admiration of her inaccessible beauty, and moving their right hands to their mouths, while their forefinger was placed on their erect thumb, venerated her with religious adorations, as if she had been the goddess Venus herself. And now fame had pervaded the neighboring cities and contiguous regions, and had reported that the goddess whom the azure profundity of the deep brought forth, and the dew of the foamy billows nourished, now everywhere exhibiting her divinity, was conversant with the midst of the people, or certainly that once more, from a new bosom of the celestial stars, not the sea, but the earth, had produced another Venus. Endued with virgin-like flower, thus opinion increased immensely every day. Thus extended fame wandered over the neighboring islands, a great part of the continent, and the multitude of provinces. Now many mortals, by long journey on land, or over the deep passages of the sea, came to behold the glorious specimen of the age. No one sailed to Paphos, no one to Cnidus, or even to Cythera, for the spectacle of the goddess Venus. The sacred concerns of the goddess were abandoned. Her temples were deformed, her ceremonies neglected, her images uncrowned, and her desolate altars defiled with frigid ashes, while a girl was supplicated in her stead, and the divinity of so great a goddess was appeased in the human countenance, and the name of the absent Venus was propitiated in the morning progressions, victims, and banquets of the Virgin. And now the people frequently assembling in the streets, and throwing flowers intertwined with garlands, or loosely scattering them, prayed to her divinity. This immoderate translation of celestial honors to the worship of a mortal virgin inflamed the vehement mind of true Venus, so that, impatient with indignation, and raging high in her agitated head, she thus discoursed with herself: Behold the ancient parent of the nature of things! Lo, the first origin of the elements! Behold the bountiful Venus of the whole universe, the honor of whose majesty is divided with a mortal girl, and whose name, raised to the heavens, is profaned by sordid terrestrials. Indeed, by sharing in common the expiations which are offered to divinity, I sustain an uncertain part of deputed veneration, and a girl of noxious morality bears about my celestial image. It is in vain that the shepherd, Paris, whose justice and faith the mighty Jupiter approved, preferred me to such great goddesses, on account of my illustrious form. But she who thus rejoices, whosoever she be, shall not usurp my honors, for I will cause her to repent of her illicit beauty. And immediately she calls her son, that winged and sufficiently rash youth, who, with his depraved manners, contemning public discipline, armed with flames and arrows, running through other men's houses by night, and corrupting the matrimony of all, commits such mighty wickedness with impunity, and effects nothing useful and good. Him, though haughty by genuine license, she stimulates by her words. She brings him to the city, and openly shows him Psyche, for this was the name of the girl. And having told him the whole tale concerning the emulation of her beauty, groaning and raging with indignation, I beseech thee, says she, by the leagues of maternal love, by the sweet wounds of thine arrow, by the mellifluous burnings of that flame, to afford thy parent full revenge through your reverence of me, and severely punish that rebellious beauty. Above all, willingly effect this one thing, that the Virgin may be detained by most ardent love of the lowest of mankind, whom fortune has deprived of his dignity, patrimony, and safety, and so infirm that he may not find his equal in misery throughout the world. Having thus spoke, and for a long time, and closely embraced her son with ardent kisses, she sought the neighboring margin of their affluent shore, and with rosy feet trod on the topmost dew of the vibrating waves. Behold, now the water of the profound sea was appeased from its vertex, and the marine train, which she just began to wish, appeared without delay, as if she had previously commanded its attendance. The daughters of Nereus were present, singing choruses, and Portunus, rough with his cerulean beard, and Cilicia, heavy with her fishy bosom, small Polemon, the charioteer of the dolphin, the company of the Tritons, everywhere furrowing the sea, and while this softly blows his sounding shell, that with a silken covering resists the unfriendly ardor of the sun, another carries a mirror before the eyes of his mistress, the others swim under the two-yoked car. Such was the train which attended Venus, proceeding to the ocean. In the meantime, Psyche perceived no advantage to herself from her admirable beauty. She was seen by all and praised by all, yet no one, neither kings nor nobles, nor any of the common people, approached as a suitor for her possession in marriage. They admired, indeed, her divine form, but they all admired it as an image artificially polished. Some time prior to this, her two sisters, whose moderate beauty had not been celebrated by mankind, having been married to suitor kings, now obtained happy nuptials. But the virgin Psyche, sitting desolate at home, lamented her deserted solitude, sick in her body and wounded in her soul, and though pleasing to all nations, she hates the beauty in herself. But the most miserable father of the most unfortunate daughter, suspecting the celestial hatred, and fearing the wrath of the gods, questioned the most ancient oracle of the Milesian god, and sought so great a divinity by prayers and victims, nuptials and a husband for the sorrowful virgin. Apollo, therefore, though a Grecian and Ionian, on account of the builders of Milesia, gave the following oracle in Latin verse. On some high mountain's craggy summit place, the virgin, decked for deadly nuptial rites, nor hope a son-in-law of mortal race, but a dire mischief, viperous and fierce, who flies through ether, and with fire and sword tires and debilitates whate'er exists. Terrific to the powers that reign on high, e'en mighty Jove the winged destroyer dreads, and streams and Stygian shades abhor the pest. The king, whose days till then had been crowned with felicity, on hearing this sacred oracle, returned slowly home, oppressed with sorrow, and disclosed to his wife the mandates of the unpropitious fate. Many days were passed on this occasion in grief, weeping, and lamenting, but the cruel injunctions of the dire oracle now required to be accomplished. Now preparations were made for the deadly nuptials of the most miserable virgin. Now the nuptial was changed into a funeral torch, and the sound of the Zayian, or conjugal, pipe into the querulous Lydian measure. The joyful hymnal song closed with mournful howling, and the wretched bride wiped away her tears with her own nuptial veil. The whole city likewise lamented the sad destiny of the royal house, and public mourning was immediately proclaimed on the occasion. The necessity, however, of complying with the celestial mandates importunately urged the miserable Psyche to her destined punishment. The solemnities, therefore, of the mournful marriage being accomplished with extreme sorrow, the living funeral takes place, followed by all the people, and the weeping Psyche attends not her nuptials, but her obsequies. However, while her sorrowful parents, who were overwhelmed with such a mighty evil, endeavored to delay the execution of the nefarious sentence, she herself exhorted them to a compliance in the following words: "Why do you torture your unhappy old age with long-continued weeping? Why do you waste your spirits, which indeed are more mine than yours, with such frequent groans? Why do you deform your countenances, which in my sight are so venerable, with unavailing tears? Why do you lacerate my eyes in your own? Why do you thus tear your hoary hairs? Why thus beat your venerable breasts? These must be rewards which you are to receive of my surpassing beauty, the truth of which, having suffered a deadly blow from villainous envy, you too late perceived. Alas! Then should you have wept and lamented, then bewailed me as one lost, when the people of the nations celebrated me with divine honors, and when with one voice they called me a new Venus. I now perceive, I now clearly see, that I perish through the name of Venus alone. Lead me away, and place me on the rock to which I am destined by the oracle. I am in haste to accomplish these happy nuptials. I am in haste to see my noble husband. Why do I delay? Why do I avoid his approach, who is born for the destruction of the whole world?" The virgin, having thus spoke, was silent, and with undaunted steps mingled herself with the splendid procession of people that followed her. They advanced to the destined rock of a lofty mountain, on the summit of which, having left the royal maid alone, with the nuptial torches extinguished by their tears, they returned home, with dejected heads and desponding hearts, and her miserable parents, indeed, sinking under the weight of such a mighty calamity, shut up the gates of their palace, hid themselves in darkness, and abandoned themselves to perpetual night. But the mild gales of the gently blowing zephyr gradually raised Psyche, as she stood trembling and weeping on the summit of the rock. Her garments, through the tranquil breath of God, orbicularly expanding and bearing her through the hollows of the valley. At the bottom of the mountain softly reclined her on the bosom of a flowery turf. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Recording by Lee J. Seipel.